drawing cities and territories is integral to how we hallucinate on what they could become in the future.
Are you interested in urban water management? What do you think about overstressed urban infrastructure? How can we provide water as a right for everyone? Stay tuned for answers from Anthony Acciavatti.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Anthony Acciavatti, Diana Balmori Assistant Professor at Yale University. We will talk about his vision for the future of cities, urban density, water cycles, infrastructure retrofit, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Anthony Acciavatti is a historian, cartographer, and architect whose work explores the intersection of architecture, urbanism, and environmental history in South Asia and North America, teaching at Yale University. As a principal of Somatic Collaborative and co-founder of Manifest, a journal of American architecture and urbanism, Anthony has contributed widely to publications such as the New York Times, Cabinet, and Topos. His acclaimed book, Ganges Water Machine, Designing New India's Ancient River, offers the first comprehensive atlas of the Ganges River basin in over 50 years, crafted from a decade of fieldwork and archival research. Traversing the river basin by foot, boat, and car, Anthony meticulously documented the complex hydrological systems and seasonal rhythms of this vast region. His research delves into the environmental and socio-economic challenges tied to water resources, with Groundwater Earth, his upcoming book, investigating the global impact of groundwater extraction. Anthony's work encourages rethinking our relationship with water infrastructures and the landscapes they shape. And with that, Anthony, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your opinions on the podcast. Let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
That's a question that I think probably many people would answer in very different ways. But for me, the future of cities has so much to do with where and how citizens gain access to water. And I suppose that's because of the kind of work that I do. But I'm particularly interested in ways in which cities have increasingly begun to rely on access to groundwater, and how groundwater, which is to say water from aquifers beneath the topsoil of the earth, is what supports nearly half of all drinking water today in the world. And then certainly when it comes to farms, is over half of what we use to irrigate crops with comes from groundwater as opposed to surface water.
I love that you are so enthusiastic about your research topic, that this is how you approach the future of cities, that water, how people get and where do people get their water from? Why are you so enamored with this question? Why are you so interested in where people and how they get the water from?
There's two ways that I think about it. One is the way in which an ecologist will choose an indicator species to tell them about a set of ecosystems. Say, if we study a hawk can tell us a great deal about a set of ecosystems as an apex predator. But if we say, take the mouse that the hawk is perhaps hunting, and we focus in on the mouse as the indicator species, it tells us a whole other set of ecologies, ecosystems that are taking place, say, on the floor of a prairie or a forest. So for me, water is a really helpful way, because of the work that I do, of drawing other things into focus. For me, water becomes an entry point. It's not everything about cities, but I think water for me starts to illuminate relationships that might otherwise go unnoticed when it comes to not only where people gain access to water from, but how is that water replenished? If it's groundwater, how does rainwater replenish an aquifer? It relates all the way from the scale of the house to the scale of the building, to the neighborhood, to the city, and ultimately also to the region.
You said that there are two reasons. One is the indicator species. What is the other?
For me, the second would be that cities, when we look at their water, also speak to something that I think in some parts of the world is understood as a public good, which is, say, tap water. And in other places, it is not a public good, and everybody is effectively in charge of gaining access to it themselves. Most cities say that they provide potable drinking water, but I would say not all cities effectively do. So for me, there again, what's the relationship between, say, the residents of a city and then the services that are expected to be provided by the city or state, and what services are not? And I think fundamentally water is a really important service that usually, since sometime in some cases the 19th and certainly the 20th centuries, has been integral to what cities are meant to offer its residents.
Do you think that it should be a public good?
Yes, I think that potable water is really integral to sustaining life. And I think that it's something that's best done collectively. When it's in a more atomistic enterprise, when people are just finding their own ways to gain access to water, especially when it comes to groundwater, it raises all kinds of second and third issues around, say, not only access to water, costs of accessing that water, but it can cause subsidence, which is sinking cities, or sinkholes opening, or crevasses, cracks in the ground, which can wreak havoc on cities, but also raise all kinds of questions about wastewater contamination. So there's a whole set of public health issues around that, as well as, I think, access and equitability.
And before we move on, we will establish a few basic building blocks to use it moving forward in the conversation. 1, please explain how groundwater is. What's happening with groundwater? How is it replenished? What's the connection between groundwater and rainwater and rivers and oceans? I have no idea whether there is any connections. So please explain to us what is the connection between the different water bodies which would influence the human life. Probably also in the city, but just in general as well.
Groundwater effectively is water that has percolated into soil, sometimes also into rock formations. There's effectively two kinds of aquifers. There are what are called confined aquifers. So that's when water has percolated down, and then there's a kind of rock formation or impermeable surface above so that it's effectively trapped there. It may get replenished from other sources, especially rainwater that maybe enters elsewhere. And then an unconfined aquifer effectively is an aquifer that is replenished by rainfall. So that aquifer water percolates through the soil. Soil becomes a really excellent way to filtrate the water. And then the way that we access that is typically, in some ways, it's through just digging a well. That's historically how people have accessed groundwater, but certainly also what are called hand pumps, tube wells, bore wells, which are tube wells and bore wells are mechanized infrastructure for gaining access to groundwater, which is effectively having a filter at the tip of the well, a pump, a mechanical pump usually attached to it, and then drawing up that groundwater so that it's drinkable. Sometimes it needs to be filtrated even more because of other things that may be in the soil, but effectively groundwater is water that's underground, quite literally. And there's many different types of it, but it's very different than a surface water body because a lot of times you can't necessarily see it. Or we haven't trained ourselves that well and educated people on how to notice the effects of groundwater on the surface.
How could people see groundwater on the surface?
So certain forms of vegetation can tell you a lot about groundwater. So for instance, you may be in a more parched area, and if you see trees, if you see grasses, but you see no surface water to speak of, that oftentimes can give a hint that there is an aquifer somewhere near the surface there. Certainly after it rains, where you can see where water builds up versus areas where maybe it percolates faster into the soil, can tell you a lot about the nature of the soils that are there. So there's lots of ways, in the same way that I spoke about indicator species, there's lots of ways that the flora can tell you about what's happening down below.
And what is the depth we are talking when we are talking about groundwater?
Sometimes it's 1.5 meters below the surface of the ground, and sometimes it's 500, 600 meters down. It really depends where we're talking about. And also the age of that water. Some water is 15,000 years old, like in the Sonoran Desert. Other places, like say in the Indo-Gangetic Plains in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, it might only be 20, 25 years old or even younger. It really depends.
Is the taste of the water changing while it ages? So is it something similar with wine, for example?
It doesn't ripen per se, but the minerals that are in the water can certainly affect its taste. So you may have high levels of lime, let's say, in especially limestone formations, where you have that in the water that can make it seem quite hard. So there's things like that, or calcium, that large calcium deposits. So the minerals are really important to the taste of the water, certainly.
Thanks for entertaining my question. The other basic question is, what does the city mean to you? And I'm especially curious because you have been researching cities or water bodies which influence how a city evolves. What does the city mean to you?
There's such different ways to categorize what constitutes a city. I think sometimes we use the political boundaries of a place to describe what constitutes a city versus say there's human geographers who ask what is a city to different people. For me, one of the fascinating things is to look at access to infrastructure, particularly potable water, as being something that maybe indicates what constitutes urban versus non. Or even in places like India, you have very different definitions of what constitutes a city. For instance, there it has to do with employment. In India, a city is defined as a place where 75% of the male population is working in non-agricultural activities. So it's totally gender-based and it's based on forms of employment. I guess it really depends where we're talking about. I suppose for me, more specifically, I'm interested in spreads and densities of what constitutes a city. I think that in a place that I've done a lot of work, Uttar Pradesh in northern India, it's a state that's about half the size of California or the same size as Great Britain, but has over 200 million people living in it. So it's incredibly dense. It's agriculturally productive. It provides nearly 15% of all of India's food grains. So where city ends and begins is a bit of a tricky undertaking in terms of demarcating those edges. But I think I'm very interested in not only the urban form, but the kinds of urbanity, meaning how do people live in cities as defining what a city is. On the one hand, for me, that's why it's fascinating that a place like India might define it in terms of a specific gender and form of employment that defines a city as opposed to just a certain level of density or a set of political boundaries.
I love that you highlighted that very much depends on where are we talking about the city itself. Could you please talk about this specific Indian region, how they handle water? Because I have just very loose imagination based on Hollywood movies, how water works in India. And I would love to have something more factual than that. Please explain how they handle water in that specific Indian region.
In North India, where I do a lot of my work, there is municipal water supply, but it's oftentimes unreliable. Sometimes it's polluted. There's a lot of extra legal ways that people try to gain access to it in terms of siphoning water from the system. So certainly people depend upon that for drinking and bathing, but there's also a tremendous amount of the population that either relies on access to groundwater through public or private hand pumps, as well as tube wells and bore wells, as well as people who purchase water from lorries that are driven around the city that are selling water, oftentimes at higher rates to poorer communities than wealthier, strangely enough. It's quite an eclectic set of ways that people gain access to drinking water on a daily basis. It really depends who we're asking, where we're asking. In many farms, it's primarily through groundwater, although some are fed by canal systems, so surface water bodies. But a great deal of it is groundwater. India in general consumes more groundwater than the United States and China combined. So it's the largest consumer of groundwater in the world. And it's incredibly important, not just for irrigation, but also for drinking water.
I have no idea about the water cycle, but I assume that using too much groundwater would be very detrimental if we use it so much for drinking water. And I'm not sure how well it is replenished. So could you please talk a bit about this kind of cycle, whether it is in balance or it's freaking threatening and frightening for now?
Again, there it really depends too on where we're talking about. But what I would say is that because of the monsoons, we're anywhere between a meter and then Jarpanji, supposedly wettest place on the planet, I think 29 meters of rainfall happens over 3 months. It depends where we're talking about, but in general, the issue is that there's quite a bit of water, but that comes down from the monsoons and would percolate into the groundwater or to the aquifer. But the issue is that when you build more roads, when you build more buildings, you multiply the number of impermeable surfaces. So it creates more runoff. So water doesn't percolate or it doesn't soak like a sponge into the groundwater, and that creates lots of problems. In many areas, we have naturally high levels of groundwater. So it's more about how do we create public spaces like parks, for instance, as being one, or historically step wells as a means of recharging aquifers. And this is certainly the case in, say, on the eastern side of North India. As you go west, groundwater tends to be deeper. And so there's been more of an issue of just people going deeper and deeper to access that groundwater. So that can cause problems. The last thing I'll say is that there's naturally high levels in some parts of both South Asia, North America, Africa, less so Europe, of arsenic in the soil. So we had the largest recorded mass poisoning in human history in Bangladesh and West Bengal because of the reliance on tube wells and hand pumps and people taking in arsenic that's ultimately poisoned them and caused all kinds of health problems in these regions. And it wasn't detected until the early 1990s. So it had been going on for decades without many people knowing. So those kinds of slow-moving public health concerns are also part of access to groundwater and both the benefits it provides, but also the threats or dangers.
Okay, this is India. My friend just came back from Spain and she talked about how during the whole summer, there was no rain. Would that, for example, create an imbalance in their water use and system?
It certainly can. There's ways in which we move water from one place to another where it's surplus in an area and deficit in another. And this is a very old system that we can find in many different places that's done through canals, through aqueducts. So it very much depends. There's a kind of water banking that many cities do and regions. So they'll store water so that they have a surplus in case of, say, a drought. So we certainly have infrastructures that are put in place to do things like that. So it very much depends. Sometimes also too much water can wreak havoc on the system as well. It can overwhelm it, overload it, create lots of standing water. Standing water breeds mosquitoes. There's lots of ways in which too much, too little water has to be handled for quality of life and preserving life. Over half of all continental Europe drinks groundwater on a daily basis.
Majority of the drinking water comes from groundwater.
Yes.
One last question about the pipes, because I watched previously, John Oliver did a piece on lead poisoning, and they talked about how the pipes themselves are not contaminated, but contain lead. And that contaminated the water and thus created the generation which was affected by lead poisoning. Are we treating our groundwater and the transportation of the water carefully enough?
The fast answer is no, we're not. There's lots of ways in which wastewater can enter into groundwater to say it leaches or percolates in. And there's lots of things that can live in our wastewater, like bacteria, enteric pathogens. So by that, things like Giardia, cryptosporidium, these parasites that just wreak havoc on your intestinal system. So there's ways in which, say, wastewater can enter into groundwater. There's ways in which naturally high levels of arsenic and fluoride can be in water that also can be problematic. There's also, in some cases, we have saline deposits or saltwater intrusion can happen, especially in coastal areas where the salt water from an ocean or a sea starts to enter into the aquifer because the aquifer is being overpumped, and that provides an opportunity for that imbalance to allow saltwater intrusion. There's all kinds of ways in which, because we can't see it, it presents all kinds of problems or challenges to how we gain access to water and its effects on our bodies and that of other species as well.
After we talked about this lovely contamination, what are the three biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities for you?
I guess the three biggest concerns for me would be, and they're related to questions of water, but I think this is where I can zoom out a bit more. One is, how do we retrofit infrastructure and increase density in cities? To me, those are two big concerns that I would say I have. But also, and this is, I think, a problem or a challenge that we've had since the introduction of rail and later the automobile, is how do we resolve the scale of a city block in terms of its scale and parcel sizes to the scale of large scale mobility infrastructure? Let me put it another way. How do we resolve the dimensions of the city block with the dimensions of rail and the automobile? And I think that still remains a challenge today in terms of not only how do we resolve that, say, as a set of experiences, but also how does infrastructure quite literally become the backbone for cities? So many cities today are not willing, and citizens are not willing to pay for large scale improvements to infrastructure and the growth of cities. Those kind of questions of density, retrofitting infrastructure, and then if I had to try to sneak in a fourth, but really call it a third, is housing.
Retrofitting infrastructure and increasing density. I would assume those are connected because we want to increase the density while our infrastructure is currently not able to provide the people who live there. Do I understand it correctly, or it's completely something different?
Instead of cities continuing to expand and grow, how do we maybe also deal with cities that have already grown but are lacking that infrastructure? So I think about how, say, take a city like Los Angeles, which is kind of spreads and densities model of growth. We have the freeway system, which is a kind of publicly funded infrastructure. But in terms of, say, rail services, it's quite meager. Versus, say, New Delhi, which is a city that's full of spaghetti infrastructure as well in terms of freeways, flyovers, but also has done an incredible job of retrofitting a metro system, an incredibly robust metro system, in a way that a city like Los Angeles has never been able to do. And that retrofitting of infrastructure has also been used to then guide growth as the city continues to expand, because where you have access to that infrastructure, greater density and housing and land speculation is happening. So I think there's ways in which we can both retrofit infrastructure, but also use it to maybe in a less heavy-handed way, direct growth of cities in place and when needed, expanding as well.
From your answer, I think I understood that when we create good infrastructure, that creates appropriate growth in cities, in your imagination. Does this sound okay?
More than appropriate or inappropriate, it's that we can use that to help shape the city that we want to see for the future. Because I always think about a quote from Swati Chattopadhyay, who is an architect and architecture historian. She says something to the effect of, urban forms have a direct correlation with infrastructural norms. And for me, thinking about the relationship between infrastructure and urban form, that they're correlated with one another, is crucial. Cities that have a robust, say, subway or metro system infrastructure have a certain kind of urban form than, say, ones that are maybe more based around private mobility from a car, let's say.
What do you include into the term infrastructure? Because you talked about the pipes, the roads, but also public transport. What is in the term infrastructure?
That might be your hardest question so far because there's lots of debate, especially amongst anthropologists, about what is and isn't infrastructure. And there's ways in which people, I don't think, necessarily agree because infrastructure may be the things that used to be called public works in the Anglophone world. So things like pipes, roads. But certainly we know that there's social infrastructure that goes into these as well. So infrastructure as a term really becomes conflated between the social and the physical after World War II in the Anglophone world. We oftentimes understand then that if what used to be called public works is a kind of the house, let's say, of the roads and waterways, there's also the social infrastructure, which is in a way the housekeeping that goes into supporting the house itself. So in that way, what is and isn't infrastructure really is a question of demarcation that I don't think there's a very concise or good answer for. Because sometimes certainly anthropologists have also looked at the ways in which infrastructure can perform a role, meaning as a symbolic form of something like of roads or of monuments, or it takes on a certain monumentality. So I'm a little bit unable, or I don't have that level of hubris to try to define what is and isn't infrastructure.
And I appreciate your humbleness saying that you don't have an answer. That's really wise. Now, you mentioned New Delhi as a good example of retrofitting infrastructure. So I assume that what they did is a really good opportunity regarding the future of cities. What are the 3 biggest opportunities for you regarding the future of cities?
I would say that the opportunities are the same as the challenges. I know that sounds like a really easy answer, but I think that those challenges provide incredible opportunities because they ask us to hallucinate on what we could do in an area. And I think that architects are uniquely poised, as many designers are, of making proposals that maybe aren't even necessarily completely adopted in the places that they're suggesting them, but may get taken up somewhere else. For example, in Christopher Wren's proposal for London after its Great Fire, while portions of that were built, and I'm saying this as an ambulance is going by, so I'm terribly sorry here in Rome, but when Christopher Wren's portion of London was enacted, but not all of it, his drawings became very important for Oglethorpe's design of Savannah, Georgia, for William Penn's design of Philadelphia. So there's ways in which the work that designers do, even if it's not adopted at the time, can be taken up by other people and shape proposals that are ultimately enacted. I see challenges and opportunities as being part and parcel to what design has to offer when it comes to cities.
I love this expression that hallucinate on the problems. I just interviewed Karina Gormley, and she will be in the episode after you, but she talked about how the climate crisis is an imagination crisis because we can solve it, we just cannot imagine solving it. You are very much working with water, and you haven't authored climate change, climate crisis, sustainability, anything of the sort. May I ask you why?
It's not because I don't think that they're important, far from it. But I do think that there's ways in which we can imagine how to live in cities that addresses these issues, but doesn't come at them directly. In the same way that I was speaking about indicator species, I also think for me, averted vision, which is when we want to look at stars and we don't have a telescope. So the way we draw in a constellation of stars into greater focus is not to directly look at it, but to turn and look at it 90 degrees because our peripheral vision draws it into greater focus. So I think there are ways in which very specific challenges to cities can draw our focus in or draw in questions of climate change and adaptation that don't go directly at it, but nonetheless address it. I think about the ways in which some parts of the world climate change is something that the population is very much behind. But I also think about parts of the world where disaster management is something that people are willing to put money and political force behind. So there's ways in which climate change and adaptation is framed effectively as a form of disaster management. So there are ways that this is done. Or, for example, in the United States, people have argued, like Jake Biddle has in his book, The Great Displacement, that effectively since the time of the Flood Insurance Act in the 1960s, the US has adopted a kind of position of dealing with sea level rise or flooding as a catastrophic condition that starts to direct where you can and cannot build, or it's a legacy of the Flood Act that effectively shapes the way where people are living and building, or if they're building and living in places where they can't have access to insurance, which is a kind of infrastructure then as well. So that's a very long way of saying I think all of these things are very important, but I don't always know that it's about going directly at them. It's the best both spatial adaptation or political fix.
Fair enough. You mentioned already good solutions, which can be seen as opportunities, but they can be seen also as strengths. What are the three biggest strengths regarding the future of cities for you?
One of the strengths today is that many people want to live in cities. Cities are oftentimes attracting people for a variety of reasons that range from access to employment to lifestyles that they want to attain or maintain. So I think cities are drawing people in. I think another aspect of cities is that people want a certain kind of urbanity, which is to say they want a certain way of living collectively together. That can be in dense environments and less dense environments. But I do think the kinds of urbanity that people seek and want to foster is something that really drives cities. I think the other is that cities have a kind of catalytic effect. So there's something that's oftentimes stressful about living in them, but also something that can be incredibly exciting as well.
I would love to know whether with your research focus, with your fears and concerns and also opportunities, do you think about cities in space? Do you think about probably the next step for human evolution going out in space? Is this something which you are interested in, seeing that we might have water on Mars, or we might see better solutions for cities in space because those should be denser than, for example, LA right now?
There's a book that came out some time ago by the historian Jennifer Light called From Warfare to Welfare, where she was looking at the ways in which technologies and approaches to the environment were born out of warfare, say, during World War II, thereafter, and how because of the political circumstances in the 1950s and 60s in the US and into the 70s, there was a desire, a political pressure to use, say, technologies for exploring space to be used for life on Earth. How do we focus more on the planet and questions of social and political and ultimately also environmental justice, as opposed to just space exploration and competing interests during the Cold War? So for me, space exploration raises all kinds of questions more about how do we terraform on the Earth today. It seems quite in the distant future to me that we would be living in space in the way that I feel like has been imagined for quite some time. I'm more interested in the ways in which those technologies and approaches can maybe also be a mirror for us to rethink how we live and steward the planet we live on right now.
Is there anything specific technology or evolutionary development you would like to see, which probably comes from exploring space?
Many years ago, I'm going to repeat a line from someone who was quite senior at Alibaba that I had met, who had said he's less interested in how technology changes people, but in how people change technologies. And I suppose because I'm trained also as a historian of science and technology, I'm very interested in the ways in which something may be developed for one use, but gets used for something completely different. Like Play-Doh, the children's toy, was actually originally developed as wallpaper cleaner. Or Propecia, which was used for enlarged prostates, was also found to reverse male pattern baldness. There's ways in which something may have an intended use, but gets used for very different ends. I tend to be more interested in the ways in which people adopt technologies for ways that we're not originally anticipated. And I think that's the history of the tube well, which originally was designed as a military technology for drawing up groundwater during the American Civil War. It's used by British officers in North Africa shortly thereafter, but then is also used for agriculture and ultimately for cities in the late 19th and early 20th through the 21st century. So I think things take all kinds of paths and get adopted and used in many different ways in different circumstances. So all I can say is that when it comes to outer space, I'll be curious to see the ways in which a technology is taken up for ways that are oftentimes unanticipated by those who designed it for a specific purpose or use.
I also really like that we might invent something for one purpose, but then the users have some other ideas about that. Since you have been talking about such examples, do you have a favorite one?
Well, a favorite in the context of India would be, say, and this is a kind of social infrastructure as well as physical one example. For some time, the government in India had been promoting family planning, which is to say to try to reduce population growth. So there were lots of ways in which condoms were being shared with the population to try to reduce pregnancy. However, there were many weavers who would turn the condoms inside out and use the lubricant to lubricate their bobbins for their looms. So for me, that was a really great example of ways in which someone might take something that's used for family planning and use it for weaving textiles as just one example. That might be one of my more favorite kind of colorful ones. But I think there's so many examples of that. And again, I think that has to do too, population growth, trying to reduce populations moving to cities. There's lots of ways that we can refract that through questions of what sometimes has been called the urban age.
Anthony, you have been awesome entertaining my questions. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I don't know that I have too much of a role. I see my role in the way that Manuel de Sola Morales spoke about a culture of description when defining his urban Catalonian lab in the 70s, which is to say that I think he says that drawings of cities and territories are never literal, they're literary. And for me, speaking to that question that you mentioned with Karina, which I think is also something that Amitav Ghosh has mentioned too, in terms of people's inability to imagine climate change, I think one of the areas where designers have a lot to offer is in building a culture of description. How do we make drawings that are not just literal, but literary, that tell stories and narratives, not only about what is there today, but what could be there, for lack of a better way of putting it, tomorrow? So for me, part of what I do is try to add to that culture of description. And that is not something that just you do and then it's done. If you think about it linguistically or grammatically, it's in the present continuous. It's something that kind of constantly needs to be done, constantly needs to be refreshed and added to and amended. So for me, drawing cities and territories is integral to how we hallucinate on what they could become in the future.
Please let us know how we can do more hallucinations and better hallucinations for the better future for cities. A last question. What would you like people to know about either the hallucination of better solutions or the culture of description? What should they do with these concepts? What could they do with these concepts?
One of the exciting things about drawing something across many different scales is the ways in which you're projecting something that isn't there. There may be clues, crumbs, fragments of something that adds up to a greater whole. But I think that being able to imagine, again, going back to this question of imagination, in the way that when an architect will look at a plan, they are being asked to imagine or hallucinate what the section of the building looks like, the vertical section, and vice versa. And that is something that then when you take that and look at other fragments of the built environment or other forms of drawing or presenting conditions of space, like cities, landscapes, I think it just opens up so many possibilities and is incredibly exciting and ultimately frustrating and occasionally rewarding.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It It was really interesting to hear from Anthony that we need to hallucinate on urban problems to solve them, not to mention his fascination with water in urban areas. Matt Geiselman also talked about water infrastructure in episode 258. You can find out more about Anthony online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Anthony's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?